Well, now we're going to talk about the groundses. I guess this is one of my most favorite homesteaders to talk about because I know some more information about them and some really neat stories about them. But where they homesteaded was right under what is known as Dugway Rim, and it's one of the harshest places I could think of to build a cabin. In the wintertime the snow gets terrible deep up there, or normally gets terrible deep, and how those people survived up there is beyond my wildest imagination. But the cabin still stands there, and there's the remains of a barn that they had built. But just out of curiosity, I measured that cabin, and the inside dimensions of it is 8 feet by 10 feet. There was a man and his wife and 5 kids lived in there, and at one point they had a young baby that didn't live very long. But so, but like I say, I can't even begin to imagine how those people lived there. And another thing that was always a fascination was how they, or where they got their water, because there's no well dug up there like at all these other homesteads, or no spring or anything. Quite a few years ago, the grandson brought the mother to go look at their old homestead cabin, and I was in the middle of calving and extremely busy at the time and didn't have a chance to sit and visit with this lady, and wanted to more than you can imagine. But anyway, they went and looked at the cabin, and after a while came back down, and I was so curious about the water, I just had to take time to find out about the water situation. And she said that she was really lucky in all the time they lived there, because there was only one time that she had to go get water by herself, and she explained where they got water, and it's back up on top of this big tall rim, and I figure it's roughly 2 miles up to that water. And anyway, that's where she went and got water, and I'm assuming in a couple of maybe 5-gallon buckets, or perhaps smaller buckets, I don't know, and carried this water clear back down to their house. But she said that that's the only time she ever had to go get water on her own, because her husband used to always go get water. And it's interesting because just recently we found that one of the sons that lived there, that lives just a short distance from, actually 4 or 5 blocks from where Chad lives, and he told us that they had a wagon with a barrel on it, and they used to go get water in that barrel and bring it down in the barrel and then store it in an underground barrel when they got it there. So that kind of explained the water situation. But there, I found out since too that they had a school that they shared with at least one other family that was built in a separate location about halfway between it and the other family, and we don't know much of anything about the teacher or anything. But these woods or ground kids and some kids named Coke went to school at this schoolhouse, and the Cokes were actually relations. That they were sisters with the grounds mother, and so they went to school together at that place. But another interesting story that Uncle Mark always told about the Groundses was that one spring it had been a particularly long winter, and it was getting spring, but it hadn't got to that point quite yet. And one day Mr. Ground showed up at their house and asked if they had any extra food that they could share with him. He informed Uncle Mark that they had eaten their last can of whatever it was, or whatever they had that morning for breakfast, and didn't have any food left. And so Uncle Mark loaded up whatever they thought they needed to get them by until they could get out to town to buy more supplies, and took it up to him. And he said that when the weather cleared up in the spring of the year, that they loaded up and left and abandoned their homestead But he said that fall, here come Mr. Grounds with every single can or whatever they had given, pounds of flour or whatever, and he returned every single item back to him that fall. And I guess that, to me, just goes to show the character, not of them particularly, but most all the homesteaders and old-timers out in that country, that they were honorable people and did what was right. But it, like I say, I marvel at all the homesteaders, but particularly of the Groundses, at how they survived in that little tiny cabin. And this son named Ronald that we've come in contact with said that the stove sit not up against the wall like you would think in there, but it was kind of set out in the middle of the cabin. And he tells us that they just laid around on the floor. Each one of them had a blanket, and they just laid on the floor around the stove, and that's where they slept. But so he didn't indicate such, but I personally think that probably in the summertime particularly, or as soon as it was warm enough in the spring and that they could do it, most of those kids moved out of the cabin and went and slept out in the barn or someplace, because they just didn't have enough room in that cabin to hardly turn around. And so it's quite a fascinating story anyway about them, and goes to show what hardship some of those homesteaders went through to try and make a living out in that country.